If you've been around Fanatics for very long, you know that we really want to engage with the community a lot. So one of the ways that we do that the best is through our podcast directly to you, which is on Saturdays. There's a link in the description. Go check it out. One of the things that we do there is have a Q&A segment. So you can ask us questions on Twitter, Discord, the YouTube community page, a whole bunch of different places. And those questions are sometimes so good that it's really a shame to just spend, a couple minutes talking about each of them because we got so much stuff to go through. So every once in a while, in that same way that the comments that you leave on this video sometimes show up on the podcast to talk about, we were thinking makes sense to bring some of those questions from over there and turn them into full videos over here. So to kick us off on that trend, a very active member of our community, Benjamin Aquino, asked the following. Is there a specific genre of game that you feel is very lacking on the Switch? If so, which, and how should this be rectified? Should Nintendo use an existing franchise and adapt it to this genre, or should this be covered by existing third parties? So that's a great question. What game genres are missing on the Switch? Should that change, and if so, how? Let's talk about it. As you can tell, this is a multi-part question, so we'll have to give a multi-part answer. The first part of the question is there a specific genre of game that you feel is very lacking on the Switch? To which the answer is unequivocally, yeah. And in fairness, there are actually a few I feel are fairly lacking for one reason or another, 3 of which we'll look at here. And it's hard not to answer that part of the question without also going into the second question of, if so, which, and how should this be rectified? So that's where we'll be spending the majority of our time on this video. But even before we go into that, I'd like to mention something that I think is very interesting to me. When thinking about this topic, I realized that a lot of the game genres that are missing from the Switch are actually ones that are some of the most popular and highest grossing of all the game genres. But that really goes to show that the Nintendo Switch is actually doing a great job at fostering and catering to audiences for niche franchises that sometimes don't get as great representation, or at least don't sell as well as they have been on the Switch. It's not to say that any of these genres were small by any means, but they definitely are benefiting from the Switch's audience, whether to do with their relation to Nintendo properties and overlap in demographic, or something else. RPGs, for one, is a genre that the Switch is littered with. Not all of them are necessarily the highest caliber, but the sheer quantity that the Switch gets is insane. It seems to me this is because of the portability that makes for very easy multitasking and grinding, and since the games don't usually have as processor-demanding minute-to-minute gameplay, it's an easier port job. Then also the fact that they just sell well on the Switch. And then there are a lot of other genres too that really benefit from being on the Switch, and for example platformers, and also the very broad definition of indie games in general, which is not truly a genre of game, but to those new to them, it may as well be. As I said, these and many more genres have a lot of overlap with traditional Nintendo fans, and or are just more convenient on the form factor. So why aren't all genres of games jumping on board? That's really the question. So first, let's take a look at one that just had a release that actually is pushing the needle in the right direction. The speedometer needle, that is. Realistic racing games. Nintendo is obviously the king of kart racers, with Mario Kart and even now being one of the several homes to Crash Team Racing, Sonic Team Racing, and the world famous Garfield Kart. But when it comes to simulation or even realistic arcadey racers, the Switch is fairly lacking. Series like Forza on Xbox or Gran Turismo on PlayStation are obviously the pinnacles of the simulation side, and then there are franchises like Need for Speed, The Crew, Dirt Rally, and Burnout, and a whole lot more that fill a different kind of market than the Nintendo tried and true kart racers or Fast RMX, and likely imaginary Star Fox Grand Prix. There's an audience of gamers that want a more down-to-earth, customize your Ferrari kind of experience. Now, in all fairness, we do have some titles in this demographic already. Gears Club was just about the first that came, and now has the sequel Gears Club Unlimited. There's also V-Rally 4 and a couple more. And most recently, today, a game came out that solves the Switch's biggest issue with simulation racers. So you may or may not already know this about the Switch controllers, but the Joy-Cons, Pro Controllers, and most third-party controllers have digital triggers for the shoulder buttons, which means that these are either on or off. So either you're pressing them and it's 100%, or you're not and it's 0%. So if you think of this as a gas pedal, you either have your foot off the brake or you're just floor in it. If, however, these were analog triggers like the Xbox or PlayStation controllers, or some other ones like, say, I don't know, the GameCube controller, then you'd have some more leeway in between where there's, 50% and 10% and all that kind of stuff. And you can kind of slowly, graze it up there. That's not a phrase. And that GameCube controller support was exactly the solution that Grid Autosport used to make a playable experience in their game. There's an option for GameCube controller as an input, which allows you to customize your experience and translates across perfectly. This game also has options for a graphics, performance, and battery saver mode, which is a perfect model for scalability for the rest of these games. But that's probably one of the reasons some of these games don't come over. Control scheme is obviously a huge hurdle, as you can't expect everyone to have a GameCube controller on hand. But graphics and performance is another big reason for a lot of these games, and even the other genres we'll talk about later as well, to not come over. Since this is a popular genre, especially for some casual gamers who only really care about racing games, a lot of money and development is spent on the flash and graphics of these titles, which can be a point of pride that some developers don't want to compromise on for a Switch port. EA owning Need for Speed and Burnout and notoriously distancing themselves from the Switch is a great example of this mindset. So the two hurdles that need to be overcome is the control scheme and developers seeing value in downgrading their games enough to run effectively on the Switch. The second of these three genres seems to share that last reason with the realistic racers, which is that apparently developers don't seem to see the value in scaling their game down to run efficiently on the Switch. But this one may have another interesting reason too. Simulation sports games. Once again, as with racing games, it's certainly not to say that we don't have any sports games, but the majority of them are arcadey sports games rather than simulation ones. Once again, we do have a few that fall into this category, as these are the FIFA series, which releases next week, by the way, the NBA 2K, RBI Baseball 19, and we got WWE 2K18. But even these come with sorts of caveats. In all fairness, from what I hear about NBA 2K series, it actually does a fantastic job porting the games over without loss of many features, and outside of some invasive microtransactions in certain bits of the game, it's a great game. FIFA, as EA's only real contribution to the Switch library, comes over, to my understanding, due to a contractual obligation with FIFA to put the game on all current systems, and they do so with key features of the games missing, and thus it sells poorly, allowing them to put less effort into it the next time, which just perpetuates that cycle. And as for WWE 2K18, we all know the debacle that game was. So what are the ones that are missing? As you may know, these franchises are licensed out, and so therefore there's generally only really one relevant series for each sport at a time. So even if we had more indie developed sports sims games, they really wouldn't ever be able to fill that void for the person who wants to play the NFL game. Eventually, we'd want to have Madden, NHL, and WWE show up, among others. And frankly, these have the same exact hurdles as the racing games of developers needing to see the value in scaling it down, but they often may have an even harder time considering the engine these are built on usually spans many games, so if it wasn't built to scale for the game the first time, it definitely won't be for the next ones. So although there are some pretty stubborn developers in the bunch, it's still not the easiest task, although they do have the money for it. And speaking of money, here's some games that typically make a lot of it. First-person shooters. Sure, we've got a number of shooters, some of which even are first-person perspective. As far as third-person shooters of sort, we've got Fortnite, Overwatch coming soon, Paladins, Splatoon, Warframe, and some others. And as far as first-person goes, we've got essentially a few that are primarily single-player like Wolfenstein and Bulletstorm, and then just the odd one out that has online components such as Doom. We've also got a few indie games that try to recreate what it is that we're really talking about. What the Switch is really missing is a lot of the online multiplayer shooter experience that's emblematic of the revolution of online gaming with the Xbox forward. Although that's certainly not the beginning of online gaming in general, Nintendo actually has been doing this for years before that, but for more information on that, check out AJ's video with the little link up there. So obviously we're talking about games such as Call of Duty and Battlefield as the primary first-person shooters, but even shooters like The Division and Borderlands are absent from the Switch lineup too. And these games not coming over are the epitome of all of the other reasons combined, along with a few others. First and foremost, these are often the main cash cows of these developers. Activision would have a dramatically different year if it weren't for Call of Duty, for example. And they do already have a huge faction of people working on those games to come out in time and look as good as they can to make the developer look as good as possible. So to them, the extra time and effort to scale the game down themselves on an engine that's not really built to work on a specific piece of hardware, or even pay another studio to do it, may not sound that appealing, even if the potential for extra sales exists. This is not to mention the fact that historically first-person shooters have not sold well on Nintendo consoles, although I think that would be a different story now. And finally, the performance would most likely need to cut to being 30 frames per second, which for an FPS may not be appealing to some. So those are a lot of the reasons that third-party developers don't seem to want to put some of their games on Switch. But you know what? I just don't know if all of those are even enough to not give it one single good shot. Call of Duty Mobile is coming out on October 1st, and that game inevitably is going to either look worse, run worse, or maybe both than it would on the Nintendo Switch, which is a unified platform that can be targeted, as opposed to all sorts of different cell phones, which some will run it really well and some not so much. But the thing is, Activision sees the potential money made in it, so they're just going to do it anyway. And before answering that last part of Benjamin's question, I do want to touch on one key point. Why is it even important that these games come in the first place? I mean, all things considered, the Switch has plenty of games. These games come out on plenty of platforms, like why do they have to cross-pollinate? Well, I believe there are two main reasons. First of all, honestly, not everyone has the money to be able to buy an Xbox and a Switch, or a gaming PC and a PS4. But there are games that are exclusives for a reason, and games that are multiplats for a reason. If someone wants to play Nintendo first-party games, they'd need a Switch. But if they'd also want to play the sports games, racing games, or shooters, they would need to think twice whether they can afford more than one console instead of buying groceries for a while, or make a decision between the first-party games and the multi-platform games that have just decided to skip that console. So the games making their way over would facilitate any scenario like that a whole lot better. And secondly, there are more and more traditionally Nintendo gamers that already do have a Switch, and I think would be willing to give these franchises a shot, especially if they go on sale as quickly as they do on other platforms, and this would simply bring a bigger audience to those developers. So then the last part of the question is quite simple. Should Nintendo use an existing franchise and adapt it to this genre, or should this be covered by existing third parties? I think Splatoon was the closest we'll see Nintendo to doing this kind of thing in true form. Sports games, racing games, and shooters are genres that already are covered by the Nintendo developed banner, but in their own unique ways. However, there are still two ways Nintendo can get involved with this topic. The first is working closely with those third-party games, whether this be directly publishing, like with Astral Chain, Daemon X Machina, or recently Dragon Quest XI's outside of Japan, or alternatively working with developers in the way that they're rumored to have with Bethesda for Doom and Skyrim, and CD Projekt Red for The Witcher 3, where they seem to have orchestrated deals of sorts to make the transition easier for the developers. Along these lines, I could see Nintendo approaching Ubisoft to have The Crew or The Division come over with some good deals, or Activision with Call of Duty, and 2K with WW2K. Yeah, never mind. We're good on that one. But the other way I could see this going is an exclusive game in these genres come to Nintendo and them co-owning the property in some way with a third or second party developer. There's a lot of ways this all could go, and although there's still a ton of games on the Switch right now, there's a lot of genres that we could do with seeing more of, and a lot of people would feel welcomed in if those genres started showing up just a little bit more. But that's what I think. What do you think? Is there a franchise of games that if it showed up on the Switch, one of your friends would jump on immediately? I'm very curious about that. Let me know down in the comment section below. And like I said at the top of the show, we'll take some of those comments and answer them on our podcast, or not answer them, just talk about them, something like that. We'll see what it is. And then also while you're down there, leave a like on the video and subscribe to FanatixFour for more videos like this every Tuesday and Thursday at 4 p.m. Eastern Central. You already know Eastern Time. You already know about the podcast, all that stuff. That's about it for me. Have a great old time. See you next time.